Hello and welcome to the fifth video in the Powershell Scripting series. In this video we'll cover for loops. There are several different types of loops that we'll go over the next few videos. For loops are kind of the basic, and they're one of the more difficult to grasp for if you're not familiar with them, so figured we'd start there. We'll go over a couple bullet points and then get into some demos. Thank you for watching. If you find this helpful, feel free to give it a like. If you want to see more content coming up as we release it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and let's get into the PowerPoint. All right, let's get into the presentation from the Microsoft documentation on for loops. A for loop is a command that can be used to run statements based on a conditional test and then execute code inside of a set of code blocks or script blocks. They function in the exact same way as a loop in other languages like JavaScript, C++, C#, or Python. The only thing that really varies is the way they're written. PowerShell for loops will use a combination of the comparison operators' names, like instead of, or the initials for their names, I should say, like instead of the greater than or less than symbol. PowerShell will use a hyphen LT for less than or GT for greater than. Less than or equal to will be LE, things like that. We'll see a couple demonstrations of that in the demos. So, moving on, for loops are typically used to iterate through an array of objects and act on that information in some way. They are used mostly when the total number of objects is known, or we can obtain it through like get, or with the length method of an array or a group of objects. When we don't know how many times we'll iterate through, we'll usually use a while loop, and we'll go over those in the next video. They're more for, I use them mostly in scripts for gathering user input and checking to make sure it meets certain conditions. For loop syntax, standard syntax is, for the loop from 0 to 100 is demonstrated below. The for command is initialized, and then inside of that we'll initialize a variable called I. We'll set that equal to 0, and then condition, and then we'll run the condition, check it, make sure that it is less than or equal to 100. Every time that it is not less than or equal to 100, we will iterate it up by 1. That is what the plus plus stands for here. And then every time it runs, we will do something with the code. I looked around for some examples of using for loops, and I find that with arrays and with PowerShell objects, for each is much more useful. So we'll go over that in much more detail after while loops. But there's really 3 statements separated by semicolons here in the middle. And after that, it's all pretty standard code, just like any other language you would see. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into some demonstrations. Okay, the first thing we'll need to do is open up our PowerShell prompt from the Windows Start menu. And then we'll go ahead and initialize a basic array. We'll just fill it with integers again, 1 through 100. Same way we did in the previous video on arrays. If you didn't watch that video, go ahead and click the back button on the playlist. So we have our array here. We can go ahead and make sure that it is populated correctly just by typing it out there. And go ahead and clear the screen. So we can create a basic for statement with the for and then the opening parentheses, and we create I and initialize it equal to 0, and then in the next statement we'll compare it to something. We'll compare I, we'll make sure it's less than the total of int array dot length. So if we were to put int array dot length into the prompt, it would give us it would say 100 because there's 100 values in there. So we have to open some script blocks after our for loop, and in this case we'll go ahead and grab some particular values out of our array. But we start with the I equal to 0, and then say I is less than int array, and then length, and then we'll do whatever is behind it. So semicolon separates these statements here. Each one is separate from the other, and each one has a very critical function to do the next steps. So if all of those things happen, we're gonna iterate I, we're gonna add 1 to it every time we loop through, and then we're gonna do something. So we'll say if I matches, and then we'll just pick an arbitrary number 2. Then we want to do something with I after that. So we'll just write I to the console, and we should get anything that has a 2 in it that is inside of our range. So from 0 to 100, or 0 to 99 really. And we see here that we have these. If we wanted to add a little bit to that, I mean, this is a basic example, but if you had some data in these points, or some data in this array besides numbers, you might want something else out of it. So we can go ahead and say else if. Well, we haven't worked with if statements yet, but in case you're not familiar, you don't really need to close them off with like an else. You can just run them without the else. And if you have other statements here like we do now, you can run an else if, which asks for another condition. So we're going to say else if I matches, and then we can just pick any other number 0 through 9, and we'll pick 5. And we can say, instead of just writing the variable itself, we can go ahead and write a string that includes it. So we would open that with quotations. The double quotations here, if you were to put single quotations, you'd have to do this a little differently. But if you put double quotations in here, you can expand. It's called variable expansion. You can expand the variable, and the value of I will become whatever the variable I is set to, and not just $I. So that should go ahead, and yeah, so we'll get, because we have 2s and 5s coming out, so we get our 5s and 2s. Again, for loops, they're very useful for specific situations. In PowerShell, we often find that it's better to use for each when dealing with objects in an array, and we'll go ahead and touch more on for each in the next video. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.